This is Penn Woods. I'm interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is May the 20th, 1970. We're at Enid, Oklahoma, and I'm visiting with Dr. Stephen J. England, retired professor at Phillips University, very prominent in the Disciples of Christ Church and a past president of the International Convention of Disciples of Christ. We are going to talk about some of the early days of Phillips University and some of the earlier days of the Enid area and of Oklahoma, as Dr. England knows it. Dr. England, I wonder to start with if you could tell me about your birth, place of birth, and your family, just very briefly, your parentage.
I was born in Salida, Colorado in 1895. My father had been a pioneer settler in that part of Colorado. In fact, he was in that area before the town of Salida was established. He moved his family there from Kansas, and I was the second of his children to be born in Salida, Colorado, where all the remaining children were born. I was educated in the public schools there, attended college in Colorado Springs, and then ultimately got into the Army in World War I. After my discharge from the Army, I engaged in preaching, discovered that I needed considerable educational preparation for that work, and came to Phillips University in 1921 in order to secure education for the ministry. The facts of life worked out different from the prediction. I remained on at Phillips as a teacher and have lived in Enid and in connection with Phillips University since that time.
Dr. England, I wonder if you could describe Phillips University as it was when you attended, naming the years and how it was.
When I came to Enid in 1921, the streets were not all paved as far as the university, which is 2 miles east of the center of town. There was a streetcar line. The campus itself was still in process of development. The old equipment of buildings which had been put there in the earliest years were still in use. The street in front of the campus, running north and south across the west side of the campus, was not yet paved, still a dusty street and muddy, as a matter of fact, when it rained. The trees on the campus were still quite small, had not yet grown to their full stature.
Now let's talk a little about students and student activity. Could you give us a little bit about the life on the campus from the student standpoint?
Of course, I came here as a married student of mature years and was not vitally a part of the life of the undergraduate community, although I associated freely with these students. The student body was small. There was a high school, an accredited high school, being operated as a part of Phillips University when I came here. The high schools around in this part of the state had not attained accreditation for the most part, and the university operated this high school department until the year 1924, when the improvement in public education was enough that the services of the high school were no longer needed. I don't remember the total enrollments at the time I came here. I would suppose it was perhaps 700 or 800, something of that sort. The school, at its beginning, had announced a policy that it was opposed to the typical fraternities and sororities, largely on the ground that these were exclusive organizations, and the desire of the school was to develop and cultivate a spirit of democracy with everything open to all students. So as a result, the student life centered around activities largely on the campus. The difficulties of getting to town from the east end of Enid were great enough that the student body formed a rather close-knit group. At that early time, as I recall the student body, only a comparatively small percentage actually came from Enid and from the territory close around. Even that early, the school was attracting students from other states. For one reason, I suppose, that many of the students were in Enid in order to be educated for the ministry, and consequently they came from states wherever there were Christian churches, for at that time the school did not expect to find students being educated for the ministry in any other church than the Christian church.
I wonder if you might comment on any of the people you were associated with at Phillips who may be have made a mark in Oklahoma since this time.
I suppose it would be safe to say that any man who has been a minister of a Christian church in Oklahoma since 1930 at the latest probably would have had part or all of his ministerial education on the campus of Phillips University. I didn't do any research prior to this interview looking up names of men who might be well known, so I don't believe I could make any contribution on that score. So only the general statement that men in the ministry of the Christian church in Oklahoma from 1930 onward in all probability would have received part or all of their education on the campus at Phillips. This does not indicate that Phillips University was exclusively a school for the education of the ministry. A large number of those who were in public education also attended school here. The pre-medic course was always one that was widely noted and very successful, so that a good many men now practicing medicine in Oklahoma or in public school education or in higher education, they could be discovered who would have been in school at Phillips during those early years.
Can you tell us some of the differences between Phillips at the time that you attend and today's scene on the campus?
Well, one of the very great differences, of course, was that when I came here, I think it would be safe to say that no student owned his own automobile. If he had, he couldn't have driven it very far because there were no paved roads between cities. Students got around by riding the streetcar from the east end of Enid down to the center of town, and the scale of social life was geared to that sort of activity. We didn't have any dormitories for men in those days. Men students from outside of Enid roomed in houses near the campus. The school operated a cafeteria for the benefit of students, but there was no one single dining hall, formal dining hall, such as we have at the present time.
I wonder, thinking about Enid and when you first came here in 1921, could you describe other than what you have on streets, could you tell something about the city itself, its size, its composition, and what industries supported this area at that time?
Oh, I suppose my vague memory about the size of Enid, which is subject to correction by looking at the census returns, was that it was a city of, perhaps 15 to 20,000 when I came here. I don't recall any large-scale manufacturing industries. In fact, Enid has never attracted industry to any great extent. I wouldn't know the reason for that, but that seems to be the picture. Wheat and the harvesting of wheat and the milling of wheat for the Pillsbury people put in a mill here in Enid at a comparatively early time. Dealing with the agricultural community, providing for the farm community, the sale of farm machinery, I'm sure, must have been a big item of business in those days. Railroading was very prominent. There were lots of passenger trains running in and out of Enid. There were 2 trains each way going from Enid to Tulsa. There were through trains on the Rock Island, 4 trains a day, as I recall, passenger trains, when I came here. And this was certainly a source of income and occupation for those who are living in Enid.
Could you comment on the Disciples of Christ Church and its development over the years since you came to Enid?
When I came to Enid, there were two Christian churches, Disciples of Christ in Enid, the Central Christian Church, and then out at the east end of Enid there was the University Place Christian Church, serving largely the east end of Enid and the university community. I don't have at my tongue's end any statistics for the Christian churches in Oklahoma. I think probably there were around 300 congregations in the state in 1921 when I came here. And the number has fluctuated, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less than that over the years. As rural communities have died out with the passing of the years, congregations have ceased to exist in those communities, and corresponding congregations have, of course, been planted in the cities, so that the total number, I suspect, has remained static at about 300, something of that sort. The total number of members of Christian churches in the state will have been from, I suppose, around 35,000 when I came here in 1921, up to around 65,000 or 75,000 at the present time. In the larger cities, Oklahoma City and Tulsa, there have been numerous congregations, of course. In Enid, the number of Christian churches, Disciples of Christ, has grown from 2 to 4 at the present time.
Dr. England, you were in the Oklahoma National Guard practically since you came to Enid. I wonder if, to begin with, if you give us kind of a brief thumbnail of your career with the Oklahoma National Guard.
I'm a veteran of World War I, and when I came to Enid to go to school, there was not, of course, anything corresponding to the present GI Bill of educational rights, which I think is a very fine thing, although the government didn't think that World War I veterans needed that kind of help. I was one that certainly needed the help. When I came to Enid, what had been the state militia was being reorganized on the basis provided by national laws into what has since been known as the National Guard. General provision of this was that the federal government would provide supervision and set some standards of training, would also take surplus equipment, machines and weapons and so on, and make them available to the statewide units. The Oklahoma National Guard was just being organized when I came to Enid, and I found out that because I was a veteran of World War I with some military experience, I could enlist in the National Guard with a non-commissioned officer's rank and could earn a little money by attending drills. At that time, 48 drills a year were being provided, each of them an hour and a half in length, and a day's pay in whatever rank one held would be paid for the hour and a half drill. There was also a 15-day summer camp each year and 15 days pay at the corresponding grade. So I was interested in the National Guard largely from the financial viewpoint, although I considered it an important contribution to the military forces of the United States. In the city of Enid, an attorney, W.A. Graves, was very much interested in organizing a field artillery regiment, and he succeeded in getting this regiment organized with units at various places over the state, and he became the commanding officer with the rank of colonel. In Enid also, the regimental band was organized. It was directed in the beginning by G. Ray Bonham, who at that time was the band director and a music teacher at Enid High School. Another battery was formed, Battery A of the 189th Field Artillery. I think the original battery commander was a man named Frank Herndon. For a considerable time, this National Guard unit was housed in the basement of the convention hall. And then another unit was formed in the east end of Enid, mostly on the campus of Phillips University. It was organized by George A. Hutchinson. Hutchinson was a native of Carrier, Oklahoma. He had been in the state militia, had been federalized with that unit, had gone to Europe as a combat soldier, came back and returned to Phillips University for the completion of his college education. And he led in the organization of a battalion headquarters battery, which was housed on the campus, the school eventually erecting a brick building for an armory for this particular military unit. And I became a member of this unit, stayed with it, and because the National Guard was new and was expanding, within 2 years I had been promoted to the rank of captain and became a battery commander with the unit on the campus. I stayed with the National Guard for 15 years, ultimately getting to the place where my duties at the university interfered with the National Guard drills too greatly, so that I resigned in 1936.
Were there any call-outs on any state disasters of any sort that you participated in when you were in the Guard?
No, the local units were not called out for any disasters. They were taken to Oklahoma City at the time Jack Walton was inaugurated as governor. Some people think that was a disaster, but they didn't mobilize the National Guard on that basis at any rate. But the National Guard was not called out as a total guard for any disaster. Locally, there were some small mobilizations, some incidents that I suppose they're unusual. I never have heard of them in any other connection or in any other state. Both of them, both of the local incidents happened in connection with the governorship of Bill Murray, one of the most colorful and most vigorous persons I have ever known, and a man, from my viewpoint, of very great ability. He was a man of the people. He had himself suffered financial hardships, and he was very sympathetic with the needs and the problems of poor people. And it was in connection with the Depression, for he was the Depression time governor of Oklahoma, that locally the National Guard was brought out and given some duties. In close connection with the first of these incidents, which I remember very vividly, I would like to refer to one of the great pioneers of the Enid area, Mr. H. Champlin. Mr. Champlin became active in Enid prior to the time I came here in 1921. When I came here, he had founded the Champlin Refinery, for he had made his money from oil, largely, I understand, in the Garber-Covington area to begin with. Mr. Champlin also founded the First National Bank and was himself president of that bank at the time when the National Guard also became connected with that bank. Mr. Champlin was not only an oil man and a good businessman and a banker, he was also a Republican. And he felt about as strongly in regard to his Republican politics as Governor Murray did in politics of the Democratic Party. They'd had some dealings because in the low years of the Depression, Mr. Champlin was interested in getting as much crude oil as he could at as good a price as he could manage in order to keep his refinery going. Governor Murray was interested in reducing the production of oil so that the price per barrel would go up. And he and Mr. Champlin had some difficulties. I understand that Governor Murray at one time called out some National Guard units in order to police the oil fields because the rumor was out that oil was being produced illegally and being sold to Mr. Champlin and other refiners. And Governor Murray, of course, didn't like this, and Mr. Champlin didn't like Governor Murray. But when the Depression came on and settled in on Enid beginning in 1930, and conditions got worse and worse and worse, finally, in early 1933, the matter came to a kind of a head. Banks were closing. Oklahoma banks were closing. People were losing their life savings. Banks were going bankrupt. and Governor Murray decided that something drastic had to be done. Consequently, he issued an executive order closing all the banks in Oklahoma until the financial situation could be stabilized. I don't know whether there was any other bank than the First National Bank in Enid that defied the governor or not. But Mr. Champlin allowed it to be known that he paid no attention to a Democratic governor telling a Republican banker to close a national bank, and he announced that he was staying open. This infuriated the governor, whose boiling point was a little low. As I heard the story later, he called in his adjutant general, his military assistant, and asked him if he thought any of those units in that nest of republicanism at Enid would obey his orders if he would take over the First National Bank. The adjutant general assured him that the soldiers would obey orders. So the order was issued. The order came to my attention when Colonel Graves called me and said he had an order from the governor to close the First National Bank, and he instructed me to get enough of my men to proceed to the First National Bank and close it. Well, I dropped my duties out at the campus and got 12 men together, and we came downtown to the First National Bank. There was no trouble finding a parking place in Enid in those days. The Depression had removed a good many of the few automobiles there were from the streets. I took some men. I put 2 men at the front door, 2 men at the rear door, with instructions that they were to allow anybody to go out and nobody to go in. I went into the lobby of the First National Bank, located where it still is in Enid, and found it was crowded with people who were in there desperately trying to withdraw funds, because this was the only bank in this part of Oklahoma, at least, that was still open. And they were drawing money as fast and as heavily as they could. I went to the cashier of the bank, Mr. A.L. Butts, and asked him if he was in charge, and he told me he was. I told him that the governor of Oklahoma had ordered this bank to be closed. Mr. Butts told me then, quite vigorously, that the action was illegal, that this bank was nationally chartered, the state had no jurisdiction over it, that it was a solvent bank, and he proposed to keep its doors open. But when I informed him that I had guards at all the doors and that the bank had been taken over, Mr. Butts was quite agreeable. All he wanted to do was to speak for the record, of course. So the people who were in the bank finished their business and went out, and so Governor Murray had a solvent, nationally chartered bank in Enid, Oklahoma, under his control. So we placed our guards at the front and the rear doors, and everything went ahead. I discovered a little later, one of my men told me, that a small-statured, gray-haired man had come up to the front door and told them that he was going in. They told him that the orders were quite the contrary, and he informed them that he was the owner and president of the bank, and they told him that as far as they were concerned, he might be the emperor of China, but the orders were that nobody was to go in. Well, eventually we arranged for Mr. Champlin to go in and look at his own bank. We might have been there for quite a while if the turn of events nationally hadn't come to our rescue. It was on the 3rd day of March, 1933, when we took over the First National Bank in Enid. On the 4th day of March, Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated President of the United States, and one of his first official actions after becoming president was to close all the banks in all the United States. And so what had turned out to be quite a lark for the enlisted men, and profitable to them as far as that was concerned, was speedily stopped because the United States caught up with the state of Oklahoma and began closing banks.
You served in some special assignments under Governor Murray, didn't you?
I have one other special
Could you tell about that?
In the spring of 1934, early spring of 1934, Governor Murray again called for some help to protect people who were losing money on account of the Depression. Taxes had gone unpaid for most of the first 3 years of the 30s, and under the law, the property upon which taxes had not been paid must be sold in order to pay the taxes. Governor Murray realized that this would be a death blow to large numbers of poor people who would lose their homesteads, everything they had. So in March of 1934, again, Governor Murray called for a detachment from Enid, and I again happened to be the one with 3 other men, and we went out to Watonga, Oklahoma, in order to stop a legal tax sale which was scheduled for a Monday morning. We arrived in Watonga on a Sunday evening. We had our uniforms on. We all went to church and created quite an impression, I assure you, in that community. The next day, I went up to the courthouse and showed the orders which the governor had sent out through his adjutant general. It said simply that I was to prevent the sale of any real estate for delinquent taxes. I remember distinctly that the language of the order specified that I was to take in custody any person in authority or who pretended to be in authority who attempted to interfere with my taking over of the county offices and preventing the tax sale. I was to put these people in jail and keep them until the governor's office would tell me how to dispose of their persons. I found that the county authorities were no more eager to hold a tax sale than was Governor Murray. The only thing that bothered them was how could they legally allow the tax sale to be prevented and the county treasurer, for example, not lose his bond with the bonding company and lose his job. Well, we finally worked out a little drama, played our parts all the way through. The county treasurer came to his office at the announced time, and there were mobs of people in town, none of them with any money, but they heard there was some excitement. He announced, he read the notice, legal notice that had been published, and then stepped up and called for bids on the first piece of property. And at that point, according to my cue, I stepped up and announced that the governor of Oklahoma was taking over the treasurer's office and that the tax sale simply would not be held. And he turned around and said to the crowd, "Well, I guess we're not going to have any sale today." And so the crowd gradually dispersed. I got to the long-distance phone in 30 minutes or so and phoned in and told them that everything was calm and under control at Watonga, and that the county commissioners and the county treasurer were perfectly willing not to hold a tax sale if the governor would stand beside them. So it was called off, and I came back home. Didn't have any more adventures under Governor Murray because he was out at the end of 1934.
Do you have any other thoughts or comments or experiences you feel might be worth relating, Dr. England?
No, I don't think of anything.
All right.
If you think
Well,
of something later, why...
Fine. Well, we certainly appreciate visiting with you. We've been visiting with Dr. Stephen J. England, retired professor at the at Phillips University. Thank you very much. This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is May 20th, 1970, and we are interviewing Dr. J.C. Shirley, J. Clifford Shirley, retired professor at Phillips University. Dr. Shirley, I wonder to begin with if you would tell us something about your birth, where you were born, and your parentage.
Born in Superior, Nebraska, in 1892. My father was already on a farm down near Omega, west of Kingfisher. When I was 6 weeks old, my mother brought me down to the farm. We lived there till 1900 and then moved to Sealing in Dewey County. And I went to school there and then to Clinton, where I graduated in 1912.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Kingfisher area during the 1890, as you first remember it?
Well, of course, that was before the opening of the Cherokee Strip. It was very primitive, but there were a great many families there. In our section, there were 4 families, rather big families, most of them. Across the road were big families. I was down there recently, and there's scarcely a house within 5 miles. It was a primitive place. We hauled our wheat to Watonga or Kingfisher, with a team and wagon. We had a little country store at Omega, and it was very, very primitive. We plowed with team and plow, and we harvested binders, shocked our wheat, and pitched bundles into the thrashing machine, into wagons, and then into the thrashing machine. A very primitive farming community but a very fine community. My grandparents lived a mile and a half away. In fact, they were buried on the corner of our farm where there's a little cemetery and a church. And that's where my mother used to take me to Sunday school and church when I was too young to walk, and she'd put me on a horse and lead the horse across the pasture, and we'd crawl over the fence and go to church.
What about the roads and transportation between towns at that time?
Well, of course, they were all country roads. There were no paved roads. They were fair, kept up pretty well, but country roads, of course, except when it was muddy, and then they got pretty bad. But we didn't seem to mind. I remember with our team and wagon and load of wheat, of course, it took several hours to get to Kingfisher, 18 miles. That's about a 4-hour drive with a team with wagon of wheat.
I guess that's as far as you would ever get on an ordinary trip would be to Kingfisher.
Oh, yes. We'd leave about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, get there, do our shopping, unload our wheat, buy Mother a new dress. I got to eat at a cafeteria, or restaurant, I guess it was in those days, and we get home, late at night.
How often would you travel to Kingfisher?
Well, during the harvest time and during the summer, fairly often, several loads of wheat. Otherwise, in the wintertime, very seldom.
What recreation did you have or provide for yourselves during this period?
Well, we had in our section, there was a school where I attended. We played baseball and blackman. I don't know whether you know what blackman is or not, but we played blackman.
How do you play it?
Oh, well, you had bases, and you tried to catch each other off the base, and run each other down, have a lot of fun. And then baseball was, even in those days, beginning to be a sport.
Did you have any inter-community baseball?
No, we didn't have. Just the school.
I wonder if you could recall any particularly important events for Kingfisher or for that area when you, during the period between 1890 and 1900, what would you say were the most important events that occurred?
Well, of course, I was still just about a year old, but the opening of the Cherokee Strip was the thing I heard my people talk about, which was 93. And other than that, very little country town, fine farm families, good local churches, and I think pretty good country schools.
Can you recall any of the Cherokee Strip experiences that your parents told you about when you were there?
Well, no, they weren't up here very much during the opening of the Cherokee Strip, because we were just south in old Oklahoma.
Taking the events later than 1893, can you think of any particular things that happened in Kingfisher, any fires, tornadoes, or bad events or good events that were particularly significant?
No, there's a museum over at Kingfisher that's quite famous. That's former governor's mansion, and it's always been, I think, a very fine town. Incidentally, the cemetery is at the end of a beautiful row of cedars that's kept up by the Garden Club, and it's a very clean, beautiful place, and that's the way we remember it.
Could you describe the schools of that time?
Well, the country schools, many of them were one-room schools. In the smaller communities, for instance, I taught in a country school down near Frederick. I had 70 students in a one-room school with all the grades from primary through 8th grade, with enough big boys to have a dandy baseball team.
Were you the coach also?
I was coach and catcher and teacher. But I was about 21, and I had a 20-year-old boy who was a pitcher. His 17-year-old brother was shortstop, and we'd even play consolidated schools and give them a real battle. That was down in Tillman County between Frederick and Aldous.
How long did you live there? When did you move?
Well, we moved from Omega to Sealing in 1900. And my father was a cattleman, bought and sold cattle and hogs, and fed them, shipped them. Incidentally, he had to drive the cattle to market, to Canton or to O'Keene in early days, and to Woodward. And he had a livery stable at one time, and now and then the traveling man would want to go to Woodward, so he'd give him a driver, a team, buggy. Took all day long, from early morning to drive that man to Woodward, the next day the man get in the buggy and come back. And it was a great community, though. Sealing is still, we were over there the other day, it's still a wonderful little place, prosperous with a number of very lovely homes, and we know a good many people who still live at Sealing, some of them from Omega, incidentally, where we used to live. And we lived there till 1911, and then my father had passed away, and we moved to Clinton. I graduated from Clinton High School in 1912.
Can you think of any events in Sealing that took place that you feel might be of some importance or have been in some importance at that time?
Well, yes, one of them. There was no real hotel in Sealing, and my mother started keeping a few roomers. Father had the livery stable as well as his cattle and hogs, and finally developed into a hotel. So about 1906, she started building the only hotel that's ever been built in Sealing. And 1907, the railroads were developing, had 2 or 3 crews, one right there a mile west of Sealing, and the banks closed in 1907. They stopped those construction crews. We never had a railroad. And people said to my mother, I suppose you won't go ahead and finish your hotel. She did finish it, and had marvelous business for a number of years. That was the outstanding thing from 1900 to 1911. By the way, we had no high school when in fact, the matter is, I had to sort of halfway repeat 8th grade in order to stay in school because we had no high school. And then we did develop a high school, and I attended for a year and a half before we went to Clinton.
Could you tell us something about your high school?
Well, I was by the way, we had a professor who taught us Latin. He told us afterwards, he said, I had to work like fury to keep up with you 2 boys. And we had a very nice little high school in Sealing. Of course, it's just the beginning, so it lacked a good many of the things that you think of in a high school. I went to Clinton in January 1911, and I guess we had had enough preparation at Sealing that they put me in the junior class. And so next year, with 7 girls, and I was the only boy, I graduated from Clinton High School in 1912. And that was a thrill.
Did you have any, could you describe any activities you might have had in high school?
Well, at Clinton, our principal got a few of us together, and we had a football team. We played 1 game, I think, and that's about all with Arapahoe. It was still baseball. Football wasn't in. It wasn't an official high school team. We just a bunch of boys that got together and played a little bit. Very good teachers. Number of very fine history. Had a splendid principal, Superintendent Bryan, and high school was quite good, I think, in those days.
The going from high school, could you tell? Did you go to Phillips University as a student?
Well, after I graduated from high school, I went down to Frederick with 2 of the girls who graduated with me, and we went to Summer Institute. You could go for a month and take exam in about 20 subjects. If you made 70 or better, they'd give you a certificate to teach school. And then when I went out into the country near Frederick, I was near a little town there between Frederick and Aldous, and taught school 2 years in this country school. That's when I enrolled 1 year, 70 students with all the grades, beginning with the primer and through the 8th grade. And that's, by the way, you might be interested to know that I made 70 in theory and practice, they called it, when I took my Summer Institute the first summer. I went out and taught a year and came back and took it and made 98. So I learned my theory and practice by doing it. But I had 2 wonderful years. There were wonderful people, cotton country and corn country, hogs. That's a rich valley down there near Tipton. And I had 2 very wonderful years. Then, after the 2 years, I carried mail for a little while at Clinton, passed the exam, and was city carrier. And then in 1914, I came to Phillips.
Could you tell us about Phillips University at that time?
Well, of course, it was small at that time, just a few hundred, and we had the dean of the Bible College, and a Bible College. We had the arts and sciences. I entered the Bible College to study for the ministry. But after a year or so, they called me in one night and said, would you be willing to prepare to teach biology in high school? So I went ahead and graduated in 17 and taught high school for 2 years. I told somebody a while ago I sort of been pushed. Said, we're going to discontinue the high school, and if you'll go get a master's degree, we'll let you teach in college. So I went to Missouri and got my master's and came back in 1918 and taught in college. During the war, the reason I didn't go to war, I was in the hospital in Chicago for a month and incapacitated for nearly a year, and so I missed my service. But I started teaching in the college in the fall of 1919.
What was your student activity at the university?
Well, I was always interested in athletics. I was secretary of the athletic council. When we had the famous football team, the Iron Men, beat Texas University 10-0, other schools by big scores, I was interested. Of course, I had to work my way, or a good part of it, so I was secretary to the chancellor and then to the president, and I spent a lot of my time doing that. I did belong to a literary society where we gave programs and discussions and so on. So literary, athletics. I never did make a team. I was on the sub-team of the basketball, but never did make first team.
Could you tell us a little about your heyday of football at Phillips, of the college?
Well, that was the day, and by the way, 2 or 3 of the very famous men have died just recently. Dutch Strauss of the Enid News and Eagle, Bruce Selby, who was principal at Enid High for years, and a number of others, George Hudson, who lives here, and a number called the Iron Men. We beat such schools as OBU and Oklahoma City U 100-0 or 90-0, and beat Texas 10-0. We had a marvelous team, and they weren't paid like they sometimes are these days.
What year did you beat Texas 10-0?
Well, that was about, let me see. Oh, I've forgotten exactly.
Well, that's
I've forgotten exact year.
Sure. Now, after your graduation from Phillips, can you tell us what you did that time?
Well, I went to Missouri University and got my master's, then came back to college. And then after a few years, they made me acting dean of the College of Arts. Now, the College of Arts, the big schools, they have deans of different divisions. But the College of Arts means education, business, fine arts, and liberal arts. I was acting dean for several years, and Dr. McCash, the president, didn't want a dean that didn't have a doctor's degree. So Miss Sherry and I went to Berkeley and spent 2 years, 29, 30, 30, 31, and I got my doctor's degree at Berkeley, California, University of California. Incidentally, during that time, in the summertime, we went out to Yosemite, and I was a ranger naturalist for 8 years in Yosemite National Park. And during that time, wrote a book on redwoods, the redwoods of Coast and Sierra, coast redwoods and the big trees of the mountains. That went into 2 or 3 printings, and some 10,000 copies were printed by the University of California Press. And by the way, the day I finished my final exam for my doctor's degree, I telegraphed the president. He was in faculty meeting. He said, Professor Shirley is now Dean Shirley.
Well, I know that book is still read because I know someone who used it fairly recently as part of research being done in California. Dr. Shirley, during the period of that you were at Phillips and this period in Enid, can you think of any highlight news items in Enid, things that happened in Enid that you think are memorable and might be worth mentioning?
Well, of course, I think Enid has been a splendid growing town. Of course, that's just general. I grant that's a general statement. But the conventions that have been here, the business organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, a number of outstanding civic clubs and garden clubs, And of course, since I did my doctorate in botany, I've been especially interested in that, and have talked to many of the garden clubs of Enid and many of the civic clubs about beautification and improvement of our city. And I think it's been a very progressive, up-to-date town. I think one of the best.
During the period of the 1915 to 1917, right after World War I, could you give us a sort of a description of Enid as you recalled it at that time?
Well, of course, it was much smaller. It was what we thought of as a little town. In fact, the university was practically out in the country. And there was a interurban that ran to the corner of the campus, you remember, and made the circle. And we were really about 2 miles from town, way out in the country. And so, but Enid has supported Phillips marvelously. Businessmen, students, high school graduates. Well, I don't think Phillips could ask for better support than we've had. Just recently, they raised thousands of dollars for this speech and hearing clinic. And that's been the history right straight through.
Is Phillips involved in the Enid band meet, Tri-State band meet?
We sponsored it and began it, and Dr. Melbourne Carey is the director. We had approximately 18,000 high school boys and girls here this year. It's a tremendous affair with 30 or 40 of the principal musicians from America and even other countries as judges in this Tri-State Festival.
Tell us about the growth of the Tri-State, how it came about.
Well, way back there, Dr. Carey invited in, just the local high schools. Be nice to come in and have a day in which you'll play and march and just sort of a reunion of bands. Well, the first thing I knew, that was increased to 10 and to 20 and to 30, and included, of course, the orchestra and the glee clubs. And I wish the other night you could have been present and see 2,000 of the finest youngsters from several states. And my, what a thrill it was when they sang that last number, those 2,000, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. So it's been, and Enid has supported it to take care of 18,000 students. That's over a third of our population. But it grew from just a few bands coming in, playing more or less just a weekend outing.
This is one of the outstanding things that Phillips is known for around the state. Can you think of any other particular unique things about Phillips that might be worth mentioning?
Yes. I'm very proud of the fact that in the Cards of the Arts and Science, incidentally, a number of the doctors here in Enid are my graduates, my majors. For over 30 years, we have not had a failure in the freshman class of med school in America. And no other school in Oklahoma has that record. Way back several years ago, when a survey was made, the next highest had 7% of their students had failed. We haven't had a failure in over 30 years in medical school once they finish Phillips. If they can pass our science, English, other courses, and make good grades and be admitted, they're outstanding.
What do you attribute this to?
A good faculty. During the time I was dean, of course, it's a Christian college, it is a Christian church, but some of our finest teachers have been Presbyterians and Methodists and Church of Christ. I think one of your men used to teach at Phillips, one of the men that's in your school now. And we usually tried to get men who were dedicated to Christian education. They were interested in boys and girls. And I think first, thoroughly qualified. We saw that they had master's or doctor's degrees, that they were thoroughly Christian, whether it's Presbyterian or Methodist or some other church. And I think consecrated, dedicated, trained faculty is the reason that our students have made good around the world. Incidentally, one of our graduates, a major in my department, is one of the top men in Hawaii.
What's his name?
Don Mitchell. He was a nephew of Mr. Folks, as some of these other people remember. He's teaching in the richest boys' school in the world. He's been made really the historian of the Hawaiian Islands and lectures all over the country. Was awarded outstanding honors with Washington, D.C. and I could just name people around the world.
Why don't we name a few?
Well, Don Mitchell, of course, was one. Several of our missionaries in Africa, and in, well, Mr. Golder, missionary in China, prisoner for 3 years. Dr. Powell, of course, came from Australia, or New Zealand, and Dr. Golder from Australia. They've both been outstanding. And, of course, Dr. Powell is still on Phillips campus, but is retired, same as I am. I could name you doctors by the dozen, and a number of outstanding teachers, and many of them college teachers. In our brotherhood, a number of the outstanding leaders of Indianapolis are our graduates. And in many of the biggest churches in, well, all over the United States. James Pippin, for instance, in the First Church in Oklahoma City. George Davis in the First Church at Washington, D.C. has been there for several years. A very fine preacher, an outstanding leader. So in science, in education, so happens my own son, who has his doctorate degree, is teaching in Warrensburg, Missouri, in Northwest Teachers College, teaching elementary education. Oh, I could name dozens and dozens, from education, from music, from Bible, and from the various fields.
Could you make a comparison of the Phillips campus today as it was in the early days that you recall?
Well, of course, we're much larger. We're 1,300 students. There isn't quite the same, probably, personal relationship. It's a little more difficult when you've got larger classes and the dean has more people to see. But they still maintain the high standards of morality. The other day I walked over on the campus, and I have been on the campus, I go 2 or 3 times a week, and a young man walked out, and I started talking to him. He had sideburns and long whiskers, and I thought, well, another hippie. Well, I got talking to him, and you know what he brought up? He said, you remember when we were in CYF conference together over here so-and-so? And he was interested in Christian conferences. And I think if you get right down below the beard, that you'll find that 98% of our students are dedicated, they're here for an education. And incidentally, in all these demonstrations that have taken place, now in a few minutes, 3 of our graduates of this year will be the commencement speakers at Phillips University. The students have a part. Dr. Baker, our vice president, works with them, calls them in, they're on faculty committees, they're a part of the university, and that's something new in America. And so Phillips is changing in that respect. They're changing in larger enrollments. And then another thing that now we can see, we have a lady here from New York City. She has 4 grandchildren in Phillips. Next year she'll have 5. We have people across from Vermont to California.
Go ahead.
Okay. We have, sit down.
I have to fix that recorder.
Okay. One of the things I think is outstanding is the loyalty of our alumni. We have a lady on the campus who has 4 grandchildren. She lives in New York. We have any number that have 4 and 5 children and grandchildren in Phillips University. I was at the International Convention with Ms. Shirley, and just 2 years ago, I'd meet some of our alumni, and I'd say, well, where do you live now? Pennsylvania. But I have a son in Phillips. I'd meet the next one and say, where do you live? I live in California, but I have a daughter in Phillips. A girl who lived at Hunter, who now lives in Florida, has her daughter and her son-in-law in Phillips. A man who lives in Vermont has his daughter in Phillips. In other words, across the continent, the loyalty of our alumni, I think, is outstanding.
Mr. Shirley, the name Shirley is fairly unusual. It isn't an ordinary name. Do you happen to be related to the writer at the Oklahoma State University campus?
No, I don't think so. Shirley is an Irish name. My father was Irish. His parents came to Woodward, or really out west of Woodward, and then moved into Woodward, passed away at Woodward. We don't have many relatives. He had some brothers and a couple of sisters, but no other relatives around this section. Of course, when I used to work in Yosemite, that was about the time that Shirley Temple came into prominence. I was a naturalist, and every now and then I'd hear some lady yell, "Shirley." I'd look up, but they were yelling for Shirley, their daughter. No, I don't think we're related to any of these people.
Since being in Enid today, I've heard rumors that Phillips had future plans for returning to football. Is that correct?
I doubt it very much. We were state champions in baseball last year, and we just missed it by an inch this year. And football is too expensive. I don't think we'll return to football. Baseball and basketball and track and tennis, possible, but not football. I don't think we will.
What this question may have been asked you before, but what is the student body now of Phillips?
About 1,300.
1,500.
Well, 13 to 1,400.
Have you seen the population figures on this county and on Enid today?
53,000.
And 45,000 population.
Yes.
Didn't attain the 50, but it had a nice growth.
Yeah. It's been a great town in which to live.
Dr. Shirley, there's one other thing I'd like you to comment on, because I know that Enid is well known, and you are particularly well known for your flowers and your iris and your other things that you have grown. I wonder if you'd comment on the garden activity in Enid over the years.
Well, I'm glad to do that because, see, I taught botany and then I became conservation-minded in Yosemite. And for years, we have been developing a garden. For 20 years, I have 9 lots packed full of 300 peonies, several hundred daylilies, iris, shrubs, trees, and so on. And then, nearly 3 years ago, Governor Bellman appointed me as county chairman of Oklahoma Beautiful. I went for our park board and asked them if they'd set aside a part of Meadow Lake for an arboretum. And they gave me about 15 acres. And I've had dozens and dozens of gifts of $5 to $100 to plant trees and shrubs in the arboretum. And I make a great many speeches to garden clubs. I'm the only man who belongs to the Enid Garden Council. And I make a speech in the morning, by the way, on peonies to a garden council, to a garden club. And Enid is really a garden. We have a couple of men in this town that are outstanding iris growers, Bill Frass and Tom Munger. And of course, Ms. Shirley has beautiful iris and daylilies and many other kinds of flowers. It's really a garden city. And last year, we awarded to the businessmen the outstanding project of improvement. If you notice the trees and shrubs around the square. This year, I happen to be on the committee along with a number of others, and we met the Chamber of Commerce. We selected the Speech and Hearing Clinic, which is on the Phillips campus, a $450,000 project, as the outstanding project of Enid. And I was surprised when the Chamber of Commerce secretary listed about 25 businesses or institutions that had made improvements, like the Speech and Hearing Clinic, like the Convalescent Care Center, about the new theater and many others. So there have been some very, very fine improvements in Enid.
Dr. Shirley, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, sir.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is May 20th, 1970. I'm in Enid, Oklahoma, and we're interviewing Mr. W.J. Otgen. Is that correctly pronounced? O-T-J-E-N. What is W.J.? William J. Otgen. Mr. Otgen, to begin with, why don't you tell us a little bit about your family background, where you were born, and your parentage?
Well, I was born in Kansas on a farm a few miles outside of Parsons, Kansas. But I have no remembrance about that. My parents moved back to Ohio, and my rearing from boyhood on was in Woodville, Ohio, and then just outside of Toledo, Ohio, where my father had a farm, and had one clear up to the time that I came to Oklahoma. I came to Oklahoma in 1905. At the time, I had just graduated from the Northwestern University Law School in Evans, Illinois, and had intended to go back to Toledo, Ohio to practice. But I had worked constantly during the 3 years that I studied law, and as a result, I didn't have the length of study required by the Ohio Bar Commission. I came to Oklahoma expecting to practice as a lawyer for 1 year in Oklahoma, which would make me eligible for the bar examination in Ohio. And my thought was to spend a year here, practice here, and then go back for a bar examination in Ohio and to practice in Ohio. So I came here in September of 1905. And at that time, I came from Oklahoma City on the Rock Island train, walked uptown, and one of the ceremonies was all for celebrating the opening of the Cherokee Strip. Horsemen were had their horses tied around the square. It was windy, dusty, and looked quite Western, especially to one coming from Ohio. However, a man who had been in law school with me, Charles E. Richardson, had preceded me in Enid, and with the sign of Richardson and Otchin attorneys, he had attracted a pretty good client, and he asked me to hurry up and get here, for the client wanted to see me. That client was a lady who had considerable property in this vicinity. She was my client for years and years afterward. After I had practiced in Oklahoma for a year, I had quite a little business, nothing like the lawyers in Enid make now, but quite a little for that short period. And I thought I'd postpone the return to Ohio, and I've been postponing it ever since. At the time that I arrived here, I only knew two people in Enid. One was this lawyer, Charles Richardson. The other was Winfield Scott, who I'd met in the university and who practiced here for many years, but became Commissioner of Pensions during the Coolidge administration. And he and I were partners for several years. When he became county judge, I first practiced by myself, then became associated with Robertson Curran, a leading firm here, then West, Scott, and Otchin, and Charles West, one of the partners, became Attorney General of Oklahoma. Winfield Scott became county judge of Garfield County, and I kept on in the practice in Enid. Paragraph. In this getting acquainted in Enid, I went from one church to another on Sundays just to get acquainted with the people around here. And I found very good churches here, Methodist. And when I went there, I saw our then county judge, James B. Cullison, who was with his oldest daughter, June Cullison, and I met June in that church And after a year or so, we were married and were living together since. Have had 4 children, now grown, 2 of them in Enid. One, my son, William J. Otchin Jr., and Mrs. Mary Barnes, Barns, who lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for many years until her husband passed away. Then she returned to Enid. When I came to Enid, they had just been discussing selling the school land, and they sold what was called the school land in 1907. I bought one of those farms about east of Enid. It is now part of our Woodring airfield. I sold half of it to the airfield and sold the other half later on. But I still have one of the farms acquired there, just east of that airfield out at Enid. We recently had a test for oil completed there. I am hopeful, but don't know just what will develop. As for myself, I served as city attorney of Enid for 2 years. During the service of Governor Haskell in Oklahoma, I was appointed Assistant Attorney General, took charge specifically of a grand jury at Watonga, traveled back and forth by train from Enid to Watonga during the period I was conducting my work there. I have seen Enid develop from a very ordinary western city into the bustling, active place that it is today. In 1922, I was elected to the Oklahoma House of Representatives and served 2 years there, and then was elected to the Oklahoma State Senate and served 8 years in the Oklahoma State Senate. During my period in the Senate, the Oklahoma flag was presented to me as the senator from the district representing Garfield County, and I introduced the act establishing this flag as a flag of Oklahoma, urged its passage, and it was passed and is now our state flag. I may be making this Oh. Later on, in 1942, I was nominated by the Republicans as a candidate for governor of Oklahoma. My opponent was Robert S. Kerr, and the election was rather close. However, the election was in favor of Robert Kerr, and he served 4 years as governor of Oklahoma and then went on to be the distinguished senator from Oklahoma. I was very closely acquainted with Senator Kerr clear up to the time of his death, and we continued on very friendly terms. I also was the Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate and served and ran for the U.S. Senate in 1942 at the time that Dewey was making his race against President Truman. Before I came to Oklahoma and leaving that farm back in Toledo, Ohio, I enlisted at just the close of what was called the Spanish War. There were 10 regiments raised for service in the Philippine Islands, and I went from Toledo, Ohio to 40th and Allen, Vermont, enlisted in the 43rd United States Volunteer Infantry. We sailed from New York after a training period at 40th and Allen, Vermont, sailed through the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Suez Canal, stopping at Singapore and on to the Philippines. I served for nearly 2 years in the Philippine Islands, all of this occurring before I came to Oklahoma. During my period in the Oklahoma Senate, I was elected Commander-in-Chief of this United Spanish War Veterans, which had a membership then which was quite large. There was then about 450,000 of us. Now there is only about 5,000 or so left. I have been active in Enid, have enjoyed its wonderful growth, and my wife and children think it is one of the finest cities they have ever seen, and they like it as a place of residence and are much taken with it and are very happy and are delighted with the growth of Enid and the development of Enid, this county, and the state of Oklahoma.
Mr. Ogden, you spoke of your early service in the legislature. I wondered if you could, was that 1922 about, why don't you tell us what were the principal points of debate in legislation at that time?
About that time we started hard surface roads in Oklahoma, and it was the beginning under the State Highway Commission. There was much legislation affecting the highways, and during that 2-year period, Jack Walton was elected governor at the same time I was elected to the House of Representatives. There was considerable controversy developed between the members of the legislature and the governor, and it resulted in impeachment charges being filed against the governor. I participated in the impeachment proceedings as one of the members of the board in charge thereof, and the impeachment resulted in the removal of Governor Walton, and Edwin Trapp, then lieutenant governor, became governor. Trapp became very active in the hard surface roads of Oklahoma, and during the rest of the term, in the next 2 years, at that time I had become a member of the Oklahoma Senate. He, during the last 2 years of his administration, the first road systems in Oklahoma were completed, and Prince Gentry was a member of the Highway Commission, the Oklahoma Highway Commission, from Enid, Oklahoma at that time. Later on, after Mr. Gentry passed away, Bert Parker of Enid became Highway Commissioner and represented Enid for the rest of my term in the State Senate of Oklahoma. I have been a member with Mr. Frank Carter, and he and I have been practicing in Enid for about 30 years, during which time Mr. Carter became mayor of the city of Enid and served 2 years in that position. He is still in very active practice in Oklahoma. I have continued to maintain an office for the practice of law clear until now, and am in the office nearly every day at the present time, and still enjoy being active with the lawyers of Oklahoma.
I wonder, I'm going to turn the tape over and we continue this tape on the other side.